this was my second favorite episode of Moon Knight. Past the first one was my favorite. This is my second favorite episode of Moon Knight. So let's get into why that is and what exactly is going on in the show. We'll dig a little deeper into it, look at some of the storytelling aspects that they're doing here. So one thing that did annoy me a little bit from last night's episode, episode 4, why didn't the Ennead, the Egyptian, the forum of Egyptian gods, why didn't they send someone to verify that Harrow wasn't up to something? Like, can we do our due diligence, Egyptian gods, before we execute judgment? Basically, they basically, Khonshu gets a meeting with the Egyptian gods. He uses Mark Spector as his speaking piece because he speaks through him. He possesses him and speaks through him. All the other avatars are there for the other Egyptian gods. And the Egyptian gods are basically like, all right, well, you say that Arthur Harrow is bad. Let's ask Arthur Harrow. And Arthur Harrow, are you bad? I'm not bad. Khonshu's obviously bad. Yeah, you're right, Arthur Harrow. Khonshu's a jerk. All right, get him out of here. Right? Like they like literally lock Khonshu up in a statue without doing any due diligence. Like, can you go see what Arthur Harrow is doing? Like, that made me laugh. That made me laugh a little bit. I'm a big fan of this show, but I thought that if the Egyptian gods are only as sophisticated as your average Twitter user when it comes to due diligence, that may be something you want to take a look at. You may want to question that, call it into question. One question, by the way, I don't think we have an answer for yet is what will actually happen if Ammit is released? It's interesting that they have not revealed that to us. We have a sense that it's bad, but we don't actually know what it is that will happen if Ammit is released. And I think it's kind of interesting that they haven't gotten into that yet. But I will say this, I really loved this episode. I really, really love it. And for those of you who know me and know that I love Indiana Jones, you pretty much know why I love this episode. This felt like this is the closest thing since basically in terms of live action, this is the thing that has felt most like Indiana Jones to me, going all the way back to The Last Crusade. Now, I'm sure there's other things that have felt like Indiana Jones, and you can let me know in the comments, like, what are some of the other things that have felt like Indiana Jones to you? This really felt like Indiana Jones, and I really enjoyed the heck out of that. I did find some of the moments between Steven and Layla, I found them to be really well done, right? There's a pretty cute interactions between Steven and Layla. Layla kind of is attracted to Steven because he's basically Mark, but some things about Mark that she struggled with are not present in Steven. And then Steven, of course, is very fond of this woman who also shares his love of Egyptian things, but and he thinks she's beautiful, obviously. So I think that those are really cute scenes. But man, they were driving me nuts because I'm like, they're about to find Ammit, dude. They're about to find Ammit. You guys are making out and like having cute little scenes together. Like maybe save that for later. So it made me laugh a lot, but I didn't hate it because the scenes were really well done. So I liked it, but as a writer, I was thinking to myself, like, they're gonna find Ammit before you get down there because you're kissing. We got this really interesting reveal that Alexander the Great was Ammit's last avatar, or at least, yeah, I guess last avatar. I guess Arthur Harrow, I'm not sure is exactly her avatar yet, probably. So that's kind of an interesting take there, is that but Alexander the Great being her last avatar is interesting. Would we say that Alexander the Great was evil? Well, he was certainly a conqueror and conquered a lot of territory and killed a lot of armies in the process. Now, did he oppress people along the way? We'd have to go deeper into an understanding of who Alexander the Great was and what he was up to. So I don't know the answer to that. But it is fascinating because he was Greek, or as they say in the show, Macedonian, but still considered himself a pharaoh. I had not heard that before, and I'm not an Egyptologist, so I had to go back and look into that to see how true that was. But that was really interesting. I really liked that because I was expecting to see some sort of other Egyptian lore worked in there, but it wasn't Egyptian lore at all. It was actually Macedonian, and that was fascinating to me. So that was fun. I think it's interesting to see if they're also suggesting that Ammit was the conqueror and Alexander the Great, being her avatar, was just using her powers to do that. And that's what basically Arthur Harrow is looking for. That's interesting. That's an interesting thing to kind of explain what could happen if Ammit was released. as I mentioned at the beginning of what I was talking about here, is we don't really know what's going to happen when Ammit's released. Well, maybe that's it. Maybe Arthur Harrow becomes the next Alexander the Great and just starts conquering territories, right? That could be part of it. Now, last episode, I did predict, last episode of this show, of the Story Geek show, I did predict, I shouldn't say last episode, on Thursday's episode, last Thursday's episode, I did predict that Mark was involved in Layla's father's death. I didn't get that 100% wrong, but it did turn out that was true, that he was involved in that. And we don't know exactly how Khonshu entered the picture here yet. We do know that Mark was a mercenary who was involved in a mercenary takeover of whatever archaeological dig Layla's father was overseeing, and that Mark got caught up in all that. Layla's father was killed in that. Mark was then shot by the same group of mercenaries. So presumably because there was some sort of treasure that they were taking, although we don't even know what that was. And then presumably this is when Khonshu showed up to say, hey, Mark, if you want to live, you can be my avatar, right? Like that's probably how that unfolded. We don't get that exactly, but that seems like we can infer that to a degree. Now, if you've seen the Thor trailer, which is a fun trailer for sure, Taika Waititi, it's going to be a fun trailer. It's not surprising. But you know that we've got Egyptian gods, we've got Norse gods. Thor's a Norse god. Odin was a Norse god. Loki's a Norse god. And then we've got Greek gods now too, because they have what many people are thinking. In my reaction to that, I was like, is this supposed to be Zeus? Because it seems like it's Zeus. Well, other people are saying like, yeah, we think it's Zeus. So you got Greek gods, you got Norse gods, you got Egyptian gods, all in the MCU. So that's pretty fascinating. It goes back to my conversation with Daryl and how we talked about how that changes the power dynamics in the MCU and who has what powers and why. So those are fascinating. It is pretty interesting to suggest that the entire time the MCU has been going on, there have been Egyptian gods playing in these things in some way, shape, or form, which is really interesting. There's one point in the show that I really liked, and that's when we can get a little bit deeper into this. When Arthur Harrow is asking Layla if Mark has told her the truth, her response is, well, obviously you're dying too. And I really like that because a lot of times as writers, we realize that we need to communicate something. We need to reveal something. There's a part in Death of a Bounty Hunter here, my novel, which is coming out as a full cast audiobook soon. And there's a part in there where one character needs to tell another character that something happened. And that always feels or can feel as if it's forced exposition, because that doesn't happen. You don't see that happen a lot of times in our daily lives, where it's like, why don't you just tell me what you obviously want to tell me something? Usually people just blurt it out, right? But writers, they don't blurt things out because they're working towards a climax, or they're working towards a twist, or they're working towards an angle. And so I like the fact that she said, well, you're obviously dying to tell me what happened, because it was almost like calling out that that's a weird thing that writers do. And I like that. I thought that was cool. I also thought that one of the phrases that Arthur Harrow gave us was really interesting, because if you'll notice, he said after he shoots Mark, he says to Mark, I can't save anyone who won't save themselves. I can't save anyone who won't save themselves. And I thought that was fascinating because that goes really far back into a Western ideal. It is oftentimes conflated with a biblical ideal. Let's talk about that, because that's weird, right? This I can't save anyone who won't save themselves is very American meritocracy oriented. If you think about it, you deserve to be saved, then you can be saved, right? That's like the nature of that. If I can't save anyone who won't save themselves, so you got to be worthy of being saved, and then I'll save you. And which is kind of paradoxical in some ways. And this comes from it. This is just partially derived from an old American statement that was especially true of Christians, saying God helps those who help themselves. Very similar phrase. I can't save anyone who won't save themselves. God helps those who help themselves. And that phrase does not appear in the Bible, by the way. That's not actually something that God has ever said. People say God helps those who help themselves. Like it's not a thing. So that phrase, apparently, based on some very minor research I did, I didn't do a whole bunch of research on that because I had to watch the show yesterday. But that phrase apparently comes from an ancient Greek phrase about the gods helping those who help themselves. So think about it this way. That phrase arose from a partial truth that we need to do things in order to what we sow, we reap, right? We need to do things in order to get things. That's the way the economy of the world works that way. But what's interesting to me is that it's not a biblical phrase at all, and I don't know how the Christians in America got a hold of it to say, God helps those who help themselves, because it's actually a misinterpretation. It's an anti-Christian phrase. Let me just put it that way. It is not a fundamental understanding. I'm going to get back to Arthur Harrow in a minute, by the way, but this is just some etymology of where he's coming from. I think it's really interesting. It's not a Christian phrase at all, because the entire concept of the Christian faith, now you may not hear this very often, because again, some people start to interpret things based on their own understanding as opposed to actually delving into what the sacred texts actually say about Christianity. But the entire concept of the Christian faith is that God helps those who literally cannot help themselves. Right? There's nothing a human being can do based on an understanding of the Bible. You may disagree with this, but I'm just saying what's in the Bible, what the Bible is telling us, is there's nothing that a human being can do to be made worthy of God's grace or love. So there's nothing a human being can do to be made worthy of God's grace or love. That's interesting, because it's not at all what that phrase would suggest. God helps those who help themselves, right? That is why that Christ's death and resurrection are critical to Christ followers. Because if he doesn't die and resurrect, then we are on the hook for saving ourselves, becoming worthy to have a relationship with God. But what I would tell you as a Christ follower is, well, there's nothing we can do. That's why Christ needed to die. Well, otherwise Christ would not have needed to die and resurrect. Right? That doesn't make any sense, actually, conceptually. If you can do it yourself, why would Christ have needed to die for you? So let's circle back around to Arthur Harrow, because actually that perspective matters as it pertains to his character. And I love his use of the phrase, because what it's doing is it's showing us what his religion is, and probably by definition what Amit's religion is. He thinks that people can make themselves worthy, and that he, along with Amit, uses the scales, the tattoo he has of the scales. He uses that to weigh people to see whether or not they're worthy. And if they're not worthy, they die. If they are worthy, they get to benefit by being a part of heaven on earth, right? And the question is why is that evil? What does it mean to be worthy? How can you possibly be worthy if you are killing people so that you can bring about heaven? Is it okay to kill people? And now we're getting into the Batman question. But this is really fascinating from this character's perspective. He definitely feels like what he feels is the right thing to do, and he's pursuing that. So I think that I really like it, because for a villain to say that makes a lot of sense, because it instantly adds him as a villain in my eyes, because as a Christ follower, I don't believe that people can save themselves or make themselves worthy. And so playing with that idea, I think, is really interesting to me. It's really a fascinating thing to play with. Now, that's the last part of this episode that makes a lot of sense. But the next part is actually awesome, even though it gets bizarre. Like, some people may not have liked it. I liked it a lot. We went from Indiana Jones to 12 Monkeys. The last few scenes of this particular episode really felt like 12 Monkeys to me, and it felt really fun because of it. So I liked that kind of callback to this kind of environment where we wonder if, as the viewers, we're the ones who are crazy because we don't have any clue about what's going on, right? I like that a lot. That was really fun. And but first, before we get to that kind of crazy scene, which I'll describe in a minute, we actually see Mark sinking into a pool, which I thought was really well done visually. Because a lot of times when a character is like entering the afterlife or something, it looks really dumb. In this, I think the fact that he kept sinking into that bottomless pool, and then there's the light that's shown, and he kind of fell into the light, that was kind of cool. And for a while there, it's really funny that I was watching it thinking like, oh, this looks like the sunken place from Get Out. Looks like he's falling into the sunken place, as you see the character from Get Out falls into that kind of abyss as well. And what's funny about that is that I watched this by myself. I made notes. I wrote that down. Seems like the sunken place. And as we were watching, my wife turned to me on that scene because I watched it again with her, and she turned to me on that scene and was like, "Oh, this feels like the sunken place." I'm like, "Yeah, it totally does," which is really fun. But in this new scene, well, first of all, we get a really fun scene where we get this old VHS movie called Tombusters, which is really funny. And it looks like sort of an Indiana Jones inspired ripoff movie and we see that Stephen Grant is the lead character in that movie, and that Mark Spector has made a hero out of Stephen Grant, this guy who's looking for Egyptian relics and things. Actually, in the movie, yeah, he's actually looking for Aztec relics, but same, like he's that kind of character. And so we're wondering, does that mean that Stephen Grant doesn't actually exist and he's a figment of Mark Spector's imagination, and that he's a different personality that he's drawn to because of that? Which I thought was really an interesting question. And then we see a bunch of people in the mental institution, including both familiar characters and familiar objects. We see an action figure of the Moon Knight. There's Egyptian artifacts. I couldn't remember why there was cupcakes. They kept showing cupcakes, and I'm like, where did the cupcakes come from? Did he buy cupcakes at some point in time in the first episode or something? I don't remember that. If you remember that, let me know. But there was a bunch of things that were called out. Where there was the photo, there was the picture on Arthur Harrow is his psychiatrist. He's wearing sandals. He has a cane. Things that Arthur Harrow had in real life, whatever that means, because we don't know. And then there was a picture on the wall of the European area where Arthur Harrow was building up his followers, where we actually first see Arthur Harrow, I believe. I believe that's the first time we ever see him. So again, all of that reminded me of 12 Monkeys. There's a ton of callbacks in there. I thought it was a great scene. And then we hit the end of the episode where Mark escapes from Arthur Harrow. He finds Stephen in a sarcophagus. He passes up another sarcophagus that is definitely inhabited by the third personality, who we have yet to meet. We only have a couple episodes yet. We have yet to meet the third character. I believe this is a six episode run. Correct me if I'm wrong. It could be 8, but I'm pretty sure it's 6. And then all of a sudden they open the door and they run into the hippo goddess. And that was extremely bizarre. She spoke English and she kind of waved at them comically. She was a CG character, obviously. And then they just freak out. So this episode felt a lot more similar to Loki to me in a lot of ways. You know, there's the episode where the two Lokis, the female Loki and the male Loki, well, the normal Loki, I should say, I guess it's the 2012 Loki, for the lack of a better description, the lead character in that show. When they get to I don't remember the name of them, but they're like the Time Council, right? Like if you're in the comments, let me know what the name of them was. But they get to the Time Council, and then they realize it's all fake. Like, oh wow, this whole setup is like fake. And that's sort of what feels like is happening here in Moon Knight, is that they are showing up somewhere and it feels like maybe this is fake. Like maybe they are trapped in some sort of mind prison where they're trying to work Mark Spector out of his, belief system. So maybe there's like a world where there's one Egyptian god who can alter reality for all of the avatars who die. But maybe we'll see more of this in the upcoming episode. I don't know. I don't know much about the Egyptian goddess who is showcased as a hippo. I don't know much about that. So I will say this episode was my second favorite episode. I really, really enjoyed it. And probably after the first episode, it was something that I really thought was great. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it as much as I did.